Hi, I'm Donald Fischer, co-founder and CEO of Tidelift, and I'm excited to be here today at Upstream to talk about software plus people, an optimistic and practical way forward for the open source software supply chain. So before I get started, let me just outline the case I'm going to make over the next couple of minutes. First, software tools alone, while useful, are an incomplete solution to solve open source supply chain challenges. Secondly, I'm going to make the case that that's actually going to get worse, that software tools alone cannot meet many of the emerging open source software supply chain security requirements that are coming out. And three, I want to start the conversation around a better approach to reinforcing the open source software that we all rely on, a combination of software and people instead of trying to rely on just software after the fact. All right, so let's get started. Part one, software tools alone can be useful, but by themselves, they're not going to be able to solve today's open source software supply chain challenges. Let's dig a little bit into the history of this category and talk about why. Software-only tools for managing open source have a long history, right? And so I first became aware of this category about 20 years ago, circa 2002, with the emergence of Black Duck. No doubt there were some predecessors or antecedents to this category as well. Whether you call it software composition analysis or application security scanning, whatever, basically what all of these tools-based approaches have in common is that they take open source as a done artifact when it arrives, and then they try to inspect it and reason about it and provide some useful guidance to organizations. Look, these software-only approaches are definitely useful. They have some utility. That's why they're still around, but they do face some really important fundamental limitations that prevent them from completely solving the challenges that we face today. And so let's zoom in to a few of those challenges. So the first of those challenges is that inherently, these approaches are pretty backward looking, right? They tend to focus on things that are known about the past, known vulnerabilities mapped from the National Vulnerability Database with CVE identifiers and trying to match up against those known facts. Is that helpful? Yes, but it doesn't really address some of the things that we can all anticipate are going to happen with any software, including open source software, things that happen in the future, right? And how is that software prepared? What kind of process and methodology is put in place and verified around that software to anticipate what's going to happen in the future when there are the inevitable new security vulnerabilities discovered? How are open source projects going to deal with them? What's the incident response plan? Is there going to be a responsible disclosure so that a patch can be prepared and circulated responsibly? Without knowing those facts about the future, inherently, these approaches are going to be reactive and not proactive. Is that useful to be able to react? Yes. Is it the outcome that we all would want? It's not everything, right? We could do better. A second set of challenges around this category of software-only approaches relates to the fidelity of the metadata that the decision engines and rule engines in this software uses to make recommendations. The standard in this set of approaches is to scrape that information one way or another, either automatically, sometimes with some expert human intervention from public sources, right? Looking through either the package manager information in the package headers, sometimes looking line by line through the source, using natural language processing techniques sometimes to map all of the different ways that you might spell Apache software license for the licensing issues. But inherently, this is going to be a pretty noisy way to gather facts about open source software. To be a little bit impolite about it, it causes this classical computer science issue of garbage in, garbage out. The results that you get from your software are going to be only as good as the quality of the data that you put into it. And the implication of that is these tools, while adding value, they also produce a lot of false positives, flagging things that are not real issues or not important issues. And also there's a lot of false negatives, things that are missed, right? Because the information going in is noisy. The bottom line for teams that are using these tools on the receiving end of them, they can be very noisy, they can consume a lot of time, and they can become tedious for application developers. And by the way, they also can become quite tedious for the upstream open source maintainers behind these projects, because they'll get the same issues reported to them over and over again by folks who are responding to the output of these tools. Is it helpful? Yeah, I mean, unless you're one of those open source maintainers who already is underwater and hearing about an issue for the umpteenth time, probably it's better than nothing, but we can do better. Okay, the third set of issues around software-only approaches to this category of problems is around remediation. Simply put, your team did not write this code. If you're an application development team relying on third-party open source components, that means you're not in a great position to investigate warnings about it or to fix those warnings, cause a new release of that software, a new version of that software to exist if they're real. That means that too often these tools are providing diagnosis without treatment, to use a medical analogy, a warning without a solution. Is that better than nothing? Yeah, probably, but it's not really ideal. So, hopefully y'all agree that while these software only approaches have been helpful, have been useful, we can do better. And this is just looking at the set of attributes that we've wanted open source software to meet. Now I want to make the case that this problem is actually only going to get worse, or maybe said another way, software only approaches, they're not going to help us ensure that software meets the emerging set of standards that government and industry are establishing around open source software. Let's dig into a few of those requirements together. And what I want to do is test whether these requirements can really be readily addressed in software only approaches, or whether we actually need to go upstream and engage the creators, the open source communities around these projects. First one, let's start with a US government initiative, the NTIA Minimum Elements for Software Bill of Materials. So for folks who are not familiar with that jargon, SBOM, that's basically just NTIA defines it as a formal record containing the details and supply chain relationships of the various components used in building your software. A simpler way to think about it, it's the ingredients list for the open source software and non-open source software that flows into your application. Now, the good news here is that if we apply our regime of what things can software tools do by themselves, what things need maintainer involvement, there are some things that we can fill out in NTIA's prescribed minimum elements for software bill of materials, and a couple of optional elements at the end here. The ones that we can fill out are basically about facts about who's filling out the form and when. Now, when you go beyond that, having the knowledge and information to speak authoritatively to these other facts, like about dependency relationships and the life cycle phase of the component and accurate and complete licensing information, really it requires the actual upstream open source software maintainer to get involved to completely meet this set of requirements. Okay, so that's the NTIA set of requirements relating to SBOM. Let's look at another government initiative. Here's a standard coming out of NIST eloquently called the NIST Cybersecurity Supply Chain Risk Management Practices for Systems and Organizations. This was actually just updated in May of 2022. And if you dig into this one, it also has some requirements around software bills of material. And the standard itself explicitly mandates engaging with the open source community around these SBOM facts. If you look at the requirement for teams that are using open source projects that don't already have an SBOM, it prescribes contribute SBOM generation to the open source project as one solution. Basically join the project and contribute that practice. Second option is pay somebody else to do it, basically contribute resources to the project to add the SBOM capability. Or third, take it upon yourself to generate that SBOM for every open source component that you're consuming. And again, how are you going to answer those questions that we just looked at around software bills of material if you're not the originator of that software? By the way, the NIST requirements also specify that you should understand and review all sorts of things about the open source community, provenance of the software, in other words, where it's coming from, configuration management practices, where source code and binary code is coming from and going to, what other frameworks and libraries that open source project in turn depends on, so-called transitive dependencies, and all kinds of other information that may impact cybersecurity risks. And it requires, folks that want to meet these best practices for systems and organizations to periodically audit their open source supply chain to reassure all of these facts. That's a tall order to do with software alone downstream without actually having access to the folks making the software and the ability to impact what's in that software. So if you look at the NIST standards, we're going to need open source maintainers to work with us if we want to meet these recommendations. Okay, so maybe it's just government standards that where we need maintainer help. Let's look at a couple originating in industry. So the first of those is the OpenSSF Scorecards project. Really great project, long, comprehensive, reasonable list of standards that we would like open source projects to meet when we commercially rely on those. If we go through this list, in fairness, you might say that you could measure a few of these, basically down to the last one of them. You can't cause these projects to reliably meet these checks without engaging the open source maintainers, whether it's facts about binary artifacts in the packages or whether there are pin dependencies, the use of fuzzing tools to try to uncover buffer overflow vulnerabilities and the like. The vast majority of the activities that are specified by the OpenSSF scorecards, they require maintainers to participate, to verify them, to basically score it accurately, and then to improve the scores, or fix the low scoring issues, or validate the low scoring issues, so that we can know that these software packages meet these standards. Okay, well, yikes there. We're definitely going to need the open source maintainers to move the ball forward on the OpenSSF scorecards. Maybe lastly, let's look at a kind of a hybrid crossover industry and government collaboration. This one's the Open Source Software Security Mobilization Plan, coming out of the recent second White House Summit on open source software security. Lots of great industry and government collaborators coming up with this set of recommendations. When I applied my scorecard here, things that software tools can validate and certify and satisfy alone versus those that need to involve open source maintainers, whoa, all of them require maintainer involvement, right? From risk assessment dashboard for the open source projects, to third-party code audits, to SBOMs everywhere, upstream and downstream. We really are going to need to figure out how are we going to work together with these open source maintainers to do this. We can't slap some software on it after the fact and meet these very useful and reasonable standards that are being put out there by government, by industry, by both in collaboration. Okay, so software-only approaches don't look like they're going to get us where we need to go. There's these great, very useful, reasonable standards that I think can all agree we would love all of the software we depend on to meet. Here's the good news. We don't have to limit ourselves to just software-only approaches anymore. And that's what this last part is about of my remarks. And it's also really what Upstream is about today, exploring how we can complement software-only tools with the people element. How can we, as downstream users of open source software who rely on these software projects, how can we more directly and productively partner with the creators behind that software that we've been talking so much about? And how can we support those open source maintainers in helping us ensure that our software meets these useful standards and best practices in a way that works for the open source maintainers and the open source contributors themselves? That's the critical question, I believe. Now, here's the good news. If people are the missing link to this problem space, we know they're out there. There's an existence proof. Somebody wrote all of this software. Somebody published it. For the vast majority of them, there's an active community of contributors and protagonists in those projects. So they exist. The people are there by definition. We just need to kind of figure out how can we approach them and work with them to ensure this broader set of emerging standards and requirements can be met. Now, it behooves us to approach these open source maintainers with some humility in this conversation, I believe, because once you find these maintainers and reach out to them, you'll find out that they're often already stressed out, they're overtaxed, and frankly exhausted before we even ask them to start taking on new responsibilities for new checklists and requirements that we'd like open source to meet. How do we know this? We asked them. Here are some results from a recent survey that Tidelift conducted of open source maintainers. What are their chief dislikes about being an open source maintainer? Number one, they're not financially compensated enough. Number two, it adds to their personal stress. And number three, they feel underappreciated, that the work that they do is thankless, right? So keep that in mind before we start going to them and asking them to take on a whole bunch of new, hard to accomplish tasks, tiresome tasks, tedious tasks that are valuable, but maybe not a lot of fun for these open source maintainers who are already quite tired. Now, yet at the same time, organizations are finally prioritizing this set of issues, right? For a long time, too many folks have had their heads buried in the sand around this class of challenges and ensuring the open source software supply chain. We found this out by asking organizations, right? So these are some results from the 2022 Tidelift Open Source Software Supply Chain Survey, which found that 42% of organizations report that their current software supply chain security events like SolarWinds, the SolarWinds breach, are having a large or extremely large impact on how they approach application security in their organization. And 78% of organizations, 78%, are already using software bills of material or have a plan to do so in the next year. So organizations are paying attention. The problem is in the forefront. I mean, there's White House summits happening about this stuff, right? So there's energy that we can apply here if we can figure out how can we constructively channel it? What's the right way for us to partner with the creators behind open source to get to where we need to go? So what should we do? That is what today is all about. And I just wanted to get the conversation started with some basic suggestions, advice, maybe directions that we might follow, some things that we shouldn't do and some things that we should do. Things that we shouldn't do, like, let's remember to take a humble approach in our conversations with these open source maintainers who are doing so much already. What's not helpful is coming to them with complaints. It didn't work on my system. Why didn't you respond to my issue yet? Very unhelpful is coming to them for the 100th time with a false positive from a scanner report or a bunch of noise, asking them to, process our automatically generated reports for us. Let's not do that. What can we do? What are some constructive things that we can do with open source maintainers that we rely on? Well, one is we can pay them, right? Just pay the maintainers, enable them to have the capacity in their lives to take on these important challenges, to spend more time if we can, provide the right incentives and reward them and recognize them for the work that they're doing to ensure that our software meets these, again, reasonable standards. But also beyond just paying them, beyond a monetary incentive, there's things that we can do to just make it easier, right? And we can support them with process support. We can share some of that load. We can make direct contributions to these open source projects. Remember the US government guidance to one of the options is to get involved in the project and help contribute some of the software bill of materials, tooling and metadata. And that's the set of things that I really hope that we'll be able to talk about in a lot of different ways today here at Upstream. So just a preview, here are some of the maintainers and maintainer advocates who will be sharing their ideas with you all today here at Upstream in various parts of the event and different formats. And I encourage you, as you listen to them over the course of the day, think about what might change about our approach to open source health and security if we spend as much time focusing on the people part, the humans behind the software, as we think about standards and formats and software tools and best practices. After all, it's the people who can actually do the work that makes open source more secure. I hope that I've communicated that point or made my case when we looked at some of those standards that we all decided that we want open source to meet. It's people that can make sure that these security practices are consistently applied. And it's just the people who are the key to improving the health and security of the open source software supply chain that we all depend on. Just to wrap things up, this is an incredible moment for open source software. I hope you appreciate that. At this point, it permeates all aspects of our society. Technology does, and open source software is behind so much of that. And more people than ever are creating and using open source. And individuals and organizations and governments are waking up to the opportunity to make open source work better. There's all these new ideas bouncing around. I hope we can create some additional ideas or iterate some of these ideas today. And the basic belief that I have is that we can tackle these challenges better together with people in addition to just software tools. After all, this focus on the creators behind open source is why we called this event Upstream to begin with. And the cool thing is that if we do this right, those open source creators will be well supported, they'll be well rewarded for the important work that they do. And organizations and consumers and citizens who rely on that software will have more confidence that the open source software that we've already come to depend on will meet these useful standards. If we do it right, everybody wins. And that's what today is really all about here at Upstream, where we're asking, when it comes to making open source work better for everyone, what do we owe each other as creators or consumers or other participants in the open source ecosystem? I thank you so much for your attention today, and I invite you to actively join the conversation in the sessions that we have throughout the rest of the day. The talks will be recorded and available for viewing online later if you prefer to consume it that way. But it would be great if you can join live and participate and contribute your ideas to getting better outcomes that make open source work better for everyone. Thank you.